right. So let's ditch all those startup buzzwords for a second. You know what I mean? Like, let's get real. You're here because I think you really want to understand like how these legendary companies actually took off. Not just like the polished stories that you always hear, but like the nitty-gritty,
Yeah.
the ground level truth. And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today with Paul Graham's essay, Do Things That Don't Scale.
Yeah, and I think it's a classic for a reason. Like this essay, it just cuts through all the noise, and it reveals these kind of overlooked tactics that really separate those successful startups from everyone else. It's kind of like we're peeking behind the curtain of all these overnight success stories and seeing all the like sweat equity that went into it.
Exactly. And he starts off with this brilliant analogy. Imagine like trying to start a car engine, but like before electric starters.
Yeah.
You had to like hand crank it.
Yeah.
Put in like a ton of effort before it can run on its own. And he says that early startup growth is the same way.
Yeah, it really is a make or break stage. And it's just fascinating how this stage often gets romanticized. But the reality is it's all about you having the guts to just do the unglamorous work, the manual work, that kind of stuff that doesn't make headlines. But it sets the stage for, massive growth later.
Right. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was how much he emphasized like actively recruiting your early users. And it might sound counterintuitive, but he argues that even for products that seem like no-brainers, you can't just assume people will flock to you.
Yeah. And I think this is where a lot of founders like really stumble. We get so caught up in building the perfect product, but we forget about the human element. And Graham, I think, makes a really, really compelling case for why those early direct interactions are so critical.
Yeah. He even shares this anecdote about Stripe, the payment processing giant. And he talks about how, like, in the early days, the founders, the Collison brothers, were literally setting up users on the spot. Can you imagine that? Like the founders of a multi-billion-dollar company doing customer onboarding by hand.
I mean, it shatters so many startup myths, right? That image alone. And it goes beyond just getting those first few users. Think about the insights they were gathering about being so hands-on. I mean, the Collison brothers, they were getting real-time feedback on user needs, pain points, like even the language people were using to talk about online payments at that time. I mean, that's invaluable.
It really highlights the importance of like getting out of your coding cave and actually engaging with your users. Okay, so let's say you've managed to snag those first few users. You're feeling pretty good. But then Graham hits you with this. Early startups are fragile. He even compares them to newborn babies. It's hard to judge their potential, but those early days are critical.
Yeah, and that's where I think the founder's mindset becomes so crucial. It's easy to underestimate your own creation, especially in the beginning. Even Bill Gates, can you imagine this? He initially underestimated Microsoft's potential. He actually went back to Harvard after starting the company.
Wow, can you imagine like that alternate reality where Microsoft never became Microsoft? Talk about a sliding doors moment.
I know, right? So the key question I think to ask here is, how big could this company get if the founders do all the right things? It requires a real shift in perspective, not just focusing on the current limitations, but really envisioning that potential, even when it seems far-fetched.
And this leads to, I think, another fascinating point he makes. Seemingly small manual actions in those early days can set the trajectory for like massive success later on. Think about Airbnb, right? In the beginning, they were literally going door to door in New York City, recruiting hosts, helping them improve their listings.
It's almost like quaint right. But it just speaks volumes about their commitment to the user experience. They understood that every interaction mattered. And that personal touch, it really helped to build trust and loyalty. Imagine like having the founders of Airbnb show up at your door, talk about a memorable onboarding experience.
I know. That's not something you just forget easily. And it goes beyond just like the immediate impact. Those early efforts often shape the company's DNA. Think about it. If you're hustling like that from day one, that customer-centric mindset, it becomes ingrained in your culture.
It's a great point, yeah. It becomes less about following some kind of playbook. It's more about a deep-seated belief in the importance of the user experience.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of user acquisition and those early wins, but Graham doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He then emphasizes something that I think might surprise some people. Delighting your early users.
Yeah, and he's not talking about like basic customer service here. He's talking about going above and beyond, creating an experience that's so unexpectedly delightful that it creates buzz and turns those early adopters into, like evangelists for your company.
And he uses this really charming example of this company called Wufoo. All right. In their early days, they were sending handwritten thank you notes to every new user, handwritten notes, in the age of automated email blasts.
I know. It's such a powerful example of how a seemingly small gesture can make a huge impact. And you know what? It's probably more scalable than you might think. Think about the time and resources companies pour into these complex marketing campaigns. A handwritten note, it could be far more effective, especially in those early stages.
And it goes back to that idea of exceeding expectations. In a world where we're bombarded with impersonal marketing messages, a handwritten note, it just cuts through the noise. It makes people
Hmm.
feel seen and appreciated.
Yeah, it creates a human connection, which is something that's often missing in the digital world. And it reinforces that idea that this company is different, that they actually care about their users.
And it also challenges those limiting expectations that we've come to accept. We're so used to large impersonal companies that we've almost forgotten what it feels like to be truly delighted by a company.
It's true. And that's where small startups, they have a huge advantage. They can provide that level of personal attention and genuine care that big companies just can't replicate.
It's about bringing back that human element and showing people that businesses can be both successful and human-centered.
Absolutely. And it's also a great reminder that sometimes the most effective strategies are often the simplest ones. You don't always need like complex algorithms or sophisticated marketing campaigns. Sometimes all it takes is a handwritten note to create a lasting impression.
All right, so we've talked about the importance of user acquisition, delighting those early users. But let's not forget about the valuable feedback that those early users provide. Graham emphasizes that building a better product isn't a one-time event. It's an iterative process that requires constant feedback and refinement.
And honestly, the best feedback you'll ever get is from those early users. The ones who are actually willing to try your product in its rawest form. They're the ones that'll tell you what works, what doesn't, and what features they're craving.
That makes total sense. When you're small, you can afford to have those direct conversations with your users. Observe them using your product. Ask
Mm.
questions. Really understand their needs on a deep level. You can even kind of treat them like partners in the development process.
Yeah, and that kind of hands-on engagement, it's just not possible when you have, you know, thousands or millions of users. You have to rely on more formal methods like focus groups and surveys. And they can be helpful, but they lack that intimacy and immediacy of those early interactions.
It's about recognizing that those early users are your most valuable asset. They're the ones that are shaping the future of your product, and their feedback is pure gold. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the importance of those early efforts that don't scale and the impact they can have on a company's trajectory and culture. But you know what? We've only scratched the surface. We'll be back in part 2 to explore specific strategies for achieving that early growth.
Yeah, we'll be diving into some fascinating concepts, like starting with a contained fire, pulling a Meraki, even acting as a consultant for your first user. So stay tuned.
So welcome back to our deep dive into Paul Graham's Do Things That Don't Scale. And before we jump into specific strategies, we were talking about those early user interactions and how crucial they are for a startup's trajectory. But it's
Yeah.
just interesting to me how many founders actually resist this hands-on approach.
It's true. And Graham identifies a couple of reasons why this happens, and they're pretty insightful. First, he points out that a lot of founders come from an engineering background, right? They love building these like elegant systems,
Yeah.
but catering to like individual user needs, not so much.
It's almost like there's a cultural aversion to hand-holding in the engineering world.
Yeah.
Like the focus is on creating something that works flawlessly, not necessarily on providing personalized support, which is kind of ironic because back in the day, engineers, they often had way less power within organizations. They were the build it and they will come folks, not the ones calling the shots.
It's a fascinating point. You can be ornery when you're Scotty, but not when you're Kirk. As a founder, though, you gotta wear all the hats. And yes, that includes being like the chief customer service officer, especially in the beginning.
Makes sense. Okay, the second reason Graham gives is that founders often get really hung up on the scalability issue. They're already thinking about having 1 million users, and they just can't imagine sending personalized notes to every single person.
But that's missing the point entirely. I mean, Graham argues that for early stage startups, worrying about scaling personalized service, it's just premature. At this point, you really have nothing to lose by going above and beyond. In fact, it's often those early, intensely positive experiences that create the buzz that leads to scaling in the first place.
Yeah, it's about building those deep relationships early on that can help you grow organically. And he even suggests that delighting customers can often scale better than you'd expect.
Absolutely. There's usually a way to retain the essence of that personal touch, even as you grow. Plus, that focus on the customer, it can become so deeply embedded in your company's culture that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It becomes part of your company's DNA. Okay, and the third reason Graham highlights is that some founders, they just haven't experienced exceptional customer service themselves. They've only ever interacted with those large impersonal companies that just prioritize efficiency over everything else.
And it's a sad truth that we've just become so accustomed to mediocre customer service that we've forgotten what it feels like to be truly delighted by a company.
Right, we've lowered the bar without even realizing it. And that's where small startups have such a huge advantage. They can provide that level of personal attention and genuine care that big companies just can't replicate.
Yeah, it's about bringing back that human element and showing people that businesses can be both successful and customer-centric.
Okay, and this kind of brings us back to Steve Jobs and his relentless pursuit of what he called insanely great experiences. He wasn't just talking about well-designed products. He was talking about every touch point, every interaction a customer has with your company.
And for early-stage startups, that often means going above and beyond in terms of customer service. It's about exceeding expectations, creating an experience that people will rave about.
It's about turning those early adopters into like passionate advocates for your brand. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of those unscalable options and why so many founders resist them. Now let's dive into some specific strategies for achieving that early growth that Graham outlines in the essay.
One of the most intriguing concepts he introduces is this idea of starting with a contained fire. It's about strategically choosing a narrow market initially to achieve rapid adoption and build momentum.
And he uses that classic example of Facebook. Remember, they launched exclusively for Harvard students at first? This created a sense of exclusivity, and it
Yeah.
made it like the it thing to be a part of.
Exactly. It's like building a fire in a small enclosed space. You get that intense heat and energy because it's focused, it's concentrated. It also allows you to really understand a specific user group's needs and tailor your product accordingly.
And once you got that fire roaring in your initial niche, then you can start expanding outward.
Right. But starting small and focused, it's crucial, especially for marketplaces, which can be really tough to get off the ground. They require a critical mass of both buyers and sellers, which is hard to achieve if you're spread too thin.
Makes total sense. Airbnb is a great example of this.
Yeah.
They started by focusing on a very specific problem, finding short-term housing in New York City during conferences. Once they had a foothold in that market, they could expand to other cities and eventually become the global giant they are today.
Yeah. It's almost like a snowball effect. Okay, shifting gears a bit. Sometimes those unscalable actions, they're driven by necessity, especially for hardware startups.
Right. Graham talks about a technique he calls pulling a Meraki, named after a company that actually assembled their routers themselves in the early days. And it was a way for them to overcome those insanely high manufacturing costs and just get a product into the hands of users quickly.
And they weren't the only ones. Pebble, the smartwatch company, they did the same thing. They assembled their first watches by hand before launching that wildly successful Kickstarter campaign.
It's amazing to think that these companies, which are now household names, started out with such humble beginnings.
I know, right? And it's important to note that this approach wasn't just about saving money. It actually had some surprising benefits. It allowed for rapid design iteration, and it gave the founders a deep understanding of the manufacturing process, down to the importance of sourcing quality components.
Eric Mijikoski, the founder of Pebble, he actually talks about how he learned the hard way about sourcing good screws. Who knew that was such a critical detail?
Exactly. Sometimes those limitations, they force you to be more creative and resourceful, and that can actually lead to unexpected breakthroughs.
Okay, so we've talked about starting with a contained fire, pulling Meraki. What are some other strategies founders can use to achieve that early growth?
One that's particularly interesting is what Graham calls the consultant approach. This is where B2B startups essentially act like consultants for their first user, just obsessing over their specific needs.
So it's also like building a custom solution for that initial client.
Exactly. And the beauty of this approach is that the deep understanding that you gain from serving that one user, it can lead to a product that has much broader appeal, even in adjacent markets.
It's like finding that perfect product market fit through this like intense one-on-one engagement.
Right, and you're building a product that's truly tailored to the needs of your target market, based on real-world feedback, not just assumptions.
Okay, I'm seeing a theme here. Early success often hinges on this willingness to roll up your sleeves and just truly understand your users on a really granular level.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important concept: manual first automation. And this is about initially performing tasks manually that will eventually be automated. It might seem counterintuitive, but hear me out.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Graham uses the example of Stripe manually setting up merchant accounts for their first users. It sounds incredibly time-consuming, but it allowed them to launch faster and gain valuable insights.
And it probably prevented them from building automation that was clunky or didn't actually address user needs.
Exactly. By doing things manually first, you identify those bottlenecks and pain points, which helps you design the automation in a way that's truly efficient and user-friendly.
It's like learning to walk before you run.
Yeah.
You have to understand the mechanics before you can create a system that can do it for you.
Precisely. And this kind of ties into another common misconception about startup success: the myth of the big launch.
Yeah, that whole idea that you need to make a huge splash to be successful.
Exactly. Graham argues that massive launches are often overrated and that sustained effort and user satisfaction are far more important than those flashy announcements.
So forget about embargoes and perfectly timed press releases.
Exactly. Those things might generate some buzz, but they're not a substitute for building a truly great product and cultivating a loyal user base. It's about playing the long game, not chasing those short-term wins.
Right. Because ultimately, it's the product and the experience that will determine your success. And that applies to partnerships as well. Graham makes this point that while partnerships can be valuable down the line, they're rarely the key to early growth.
In fact, for young startups, they can often end up being more trouble than they're worth. They take time and resources away from focusing on your core product and your users.
It's about building that solid foundation first, not getting distracted by shiny objects or potential shortcuts.
Okay, and this brings us to, I think, one of the most thought-provoking concepts in the essay: the idea of startups as vectors.
Ooh, this sounds intriguing. What does he mean by that?
Well, Graham suggests that we think of startup ideas not just as products, but as a combination of the product A&D, the unscalable actions taken to get it going. It's not just about what you're building, but how you bring it to life.
So it's about going beyond the what and focusing on the how. How do you get your product into the hands of those first users? How do you make them fall in love with it?
Exactly. And those early unscalable actions, those are the things that can truly set your idea apart and determine its trajectory.
I love this. It really shifts the perspective on what it means to launch and grow a startup. It's not just about having a brilliant idea or a perfectly coded product. It's about that hustle, that personal touch, that willingness to do the things that might seem small or insignificant at the time, but that ultimately have a huge impact.
And this is where it gets really interesting. We'll pick up here in part 3 and explore how those early actions, those things that don't scale, they actually shape a company's DNA.
All right, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into do things that don't scale. And, we've been talking about all these early, often unglamorous actions that are so crucial for a startup success. But like we were saying at the end of part 2, there's another layer to this. It's not just about, getting those early wins. It's about how those actions shape the very essence of a company.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? How those early, scrappy efforts, they almost imprint themselves on the company's DNA,
Right.
influencing everything from their culture to their decision-making process.
So unpack this for me a little bit. How do those unscalable actions actually become embedded in a company's DNA?
Well, let's just take aggressive user acquisition as an example, okay? If a company has to really hustle and get creative to land those first customers, that tenacity, it often becomes a core part of their operating style, even as they grow.
It becomes less about following a playbook and more about a deep-seated belief in the importance of going above and beyond to win customers.
Exactly. It's no longer just a tactic, it's who they are. And this kind of applies to other areas as well. Remember those hardware startups we discussed? The ones that had to manufacture their own products in the early days.
Right, like Meraki and Pebble.
Exactly. It wasn't just about saving money, right? It was about them getting their hands dirty, developing a deep understanding of the product from the ground up.
They weren't just outsourcing production, they were building expertise. And that became a core part of their company.
Yeah, they learned things they wouldn't have otherwise, and it ultimately made them stronger and more resilient.
And it's almost like those limitations forced them to be resourceful, to develop a different set of muscles that ultimately made them more competitive.
Absolutely. Constraints, they can be incredibly powerful drivers of innovation.
Okay, I'm starting to see how those early struggles can really shape a company for the better. But perhaps the most important takeaway here is that if you're willing to work hard to delight users when you only have a handful of them, you're more likely to keep doing it when you have thousands or even millions.
Yeah, it's about establishing that culture of customer obsession from day one. It's not just about meeting expectations, it's about consistently exceeding them, making your users feel valued and heard.
And when that becomes part of a company's core identity, it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it can become their secret weapon. Really.
Okay, so we've talked about why doing things that don't scale is so important, and we've explored some really specific strategies. But I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, okay? At what point does it become time to scale? When do you transition from those hands-on personalized efforts to something more sustainable?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no magic formula. Every company is different, and the timing will vary depending on your product, your market, a whole host of other factors.
So how do you know when it's time to make that shift?
Well, Graham suggests looking for signs that your unscalable actions are starting to hold you back. Maybe you're spending so much time on manual tasks that you're neglecting other critical areas of the business.
Or maybe those personalized touches are becoming bottlenecks that are actually preventing you from growing as quickly as you could be.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between maintaining that personal touch and building systems that can support growth.
Yeah, I imagine that transition can be tricky. It's about letting go of some of those early habits while still staying true to your company's core values.
Absolutely. It's about evolving and adapting while still holding on to that scrappy entrepreneurial spirit that got you started in the first place.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive into do things that don't scale,
Yeah.
let's go back to that key question we posed earlier. What is your unscalable action? What's the one thing you can do right now that might seem small or insignificant, but could have a massive impact on your idea?
Yeah. It might be as simple as sending handwritten thank you notes, offering personalized onboarding for new users, or even just picking up the phone and having a conversation with someone who's expressed interest in what you're building.
It's about doing those things that others might dismiss as too time-consuming or inefficient. But that can create those meaningful connections that are so crucial in the early days.
It's about being resourceful, being human, being willing to go above and beyond. And remember, it's not just about the product, it's about the experience you create. It's about making people feel seen and heard and giving them a reason to believe in your vision.
So go out there, get your hands dirty, and start doing those things that don't scale. Who knows, you might just create the next Airbnb or Stripe in the process.
And always remember, keep learning, keep experimenting, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.